Good afternoon, everybody. So I've been very fortunate to be working for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa now for 15 years. But a few years ago, I decided to take some time out. I took a sabbatical to do some research for a book which came out in 2024 called Borderless Africa. And it was co-authored by a friend and colleague, Francis Mangini. Now, that book made, I think, some very important observations about the imperative of implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I'm, in my presentation, going to take you through some of the main ideas in that book and try to explain to you the urgency of creating a borderless Africa. So when I'm doing travel across the region, and because our office is a sub-regional one, we have to travel quite a lot for our work. I very much insist on a window seat when I'm traveling. And I like to take pictures of the countryside outside. So you can see some of the images here, really quite spectacular ones. The region is a stunningly beautiful one. Volcanoes, rivers, sandstorms, rainbows from 30,000 feet. Really incredibly impressive. A lot of these areas actually are frontier areas between countries. So, for example, this is Lake Turkana, bordering Kenya and Ethiopia, for instance. This is Bujumbura, very close to the frontier with DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is the Mountains of the Moon in Uganda, which border the Democratic Republic of Congo. And finally, if I can see that clearly, I think that's Akagera. So you can see Tanzania in the distance. What you can't see from 30,000 feet are the borders. You only realize that there are borders there when you come into land. And this has some very negative impacts, I think, the borders that we have on the continent. So this is what I'm going to be explaining in my presentation. So I see this very much from the point of view as an economist. And the borders raise three particular kinds of challenges. One is scale. The other is the lack of or slow pace of job creation. And the third point is really how trade hasn't acted as a catalyst for growth on a continent in the way it should. So if you look at an outline of the African continent, you will appreciate the many, many borders, over 110 borders across the continent. Musa Faki Muhammad, the former chairperson of the African Union, once described the African silhouette as a shattered mirror. And I think that's a very apt description of what you can see there. Now, very interestingly, in the early 1990s, people are perhaps not aware, but India and China were actually poorer in per capita income terms than the African continent, very significantly. What's happened since the 1990s, I think, is very revealing. If you look at the rate of economic growth for the African continent, in green here, you see that it's been significantly lower over these last 3.5 decades compared to India and China. And China is now in a situation where it's at least 6 times the per capita income of the average for the African continent, and India is also now substantially wealthier. Now, one of the reasons that we could attribute for that poorer growth is precisely the problem of the fragmented market, the borders that increase the costs for people doing business. There is a publication, an American publication called Fortune 500, which each year publishes a list of the largest companies in the global economy. Back in 1990, China had just 3 companies in that list. Fast forward to today, and you will see that China now has 133 companies in that list, par on par with the United States. An incredible transformation in this economy. How many companies in the list, the Fortune 500, do you think Africa currently has? It's a very easy answer. 0. Africa does not have a single company in the Fortune 500 list. And the Cameroonian economist Achaleke made a very pertinent observation. He likened large companies to baobabs. He said that you need those larger firms to basically create an ecosystem under which smaller and medium-sized firms can thrive. If the baobabs are cut down, you no longer have the protection and the ecosystem falls to pieces. So the absence of doing things at scale and the absence of sufficient number of larger companies has an economic cost for the continent. Another major challenge for the continent, which we're all aware of, is the slow pace of job creation. It's very difficult for young people to find gainful employment. Typically, we would think that as a country develops, employment will shift from the agricultural sector into higher value added and higher, better paying jobs in the industrial and services sector. On the African continent, unfortunately, this is not what we've seen over the last 3 decades. We've seen almost stagnant structural transformation, very movement of people into the industrial or services sector. So this again is a major challenge. Not enough jobs are being created outside of agricultural sector. Now, one way African countries have tried to deal with this challenge is by exporting. But typically, countries have prioritized exporting to high-income economies, particularly the European Union or the United States of America. And African exporters have been offered preferential market access over this period to access those markets. Unfortunately, these schemes, for many reasons, have not worked as people intended. And if you see here in the chart, you can appreciate the share of exports actually going to either Europe or the United States has really fallen very sharply for Eastern African countries over the last 2 decades. Africa has also tried to make use of the international trading system. We now have 44 African member states which are currently members of the World Trade Organization, in the belief that being active members of the global trading system would help turn this story around. But unfortunately, as you can see in this chart, the share of Africa in global trade has barely budged in the last 20 or 30 years. It's stayed at around 2 or 3% of total global trade. So Africa is sadly underrepresented in terms of global trade. And I think even more crucially for the continent, 80% of what Africa exports to the rest of the world is commodities, raw, unprocessed goods, minerals, oil, or raw coffee, tea, etc. Julius Nyerere, the first president of independent Tanzania, once said, we consume what we do not produce, and we produce what we do not consume. And that is still very much true for the continent. So the solution is to remove these borders so that we have a less fragmented market. And in our book, in Borderless Africa, Francis Mangini and myself explain the reasons why this is such an important move forward for the continent. Now, you may be aware the African Continental Free Trade Area was signed at a historic meeting of the African Union here in Kigali back in March 2018. Ever since that happened, there has been quite a few misconceptions, nevertheless, about the true nature of the AFCFTA. A lot of people claim that it is an imported idea, that it's a free trade area that Africa does not want or has not sought. In our book, we try to clarify that misconception and explain at some length that the AFCFTA really represents historic Pan-African ideas about how to achieve greater continental integration and economic cooperation amongst member states. We particularly in our book lean very heavily on the intellectual ideas and the academic research of people like Professor Adebayo Adedeji, who was the former executive secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa, where I worked from 1975 to 1991, and very instrumental in the Treaty of Abuja, the Treaty of Abuja being the basis for the African Continental Free Trade Area. We also cite a lot the work of the Malawian economist Thandika Makandawire, whose work and ideas about continental integration are still incredibly relevant. Sadly, both of them passed away some years ago. The beauty of having a borderless Africa is that whereas Africa's exports to the rest of the world are still commodities, raw, unprocessed goods. When you look at the composition of exports within the region, you suddenly see that it is much, much more diversified. So whereas Africa is only exporting maybe 18 or 19% of goods and manufactured goods to the rest of the world, for the sub-region, it's around half of the goods are manufactured, processed. So we argue very strongly in the book, if you wish to accelerate the transformation of your economy, you really need to push the regional angle and export more to your regional trading partners rather than aimlessly hope for a change in the global markets and the fact that sometime there will be a sudden diversification. Unfortunately, the trends for intra-African trade have been very healthy. They've actually been growing over recent years at a faster pace than we see with the global exports in the rest of the world. So there's another reason for doubling down on the regional market. A lot of people, when they present on the AFCFTA, they lament what they consider to be the low level of intra-Africa trade. They take a rough average for the continent and they compare it with European Union or with Asia. And in the book, we spend quite a bit of time explaining how inaccurate or misleading those kind of comparisons are. In our sub-region, you will see countries like South Sudan, where a very small share of their exports go to the regional market. But that's because 99% of their exports are oil, which is destined for markets outside the continent. A similar situation with the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, because of its mineral wealth, generally exports to the rest of the world. But when you start to look at other economies, such as Ugandan, Tanzanian, Kenyan, or Rwandan economy, you will see that the percentage of intra-Africa trade is already between 25 and 40%. So already before the AFCFTA has been properly implemented, we see that it is the major market for many of our member states already. So closing reflections. I like to think of regional integration like a marriage. It's never a perfect engagement, let's say. It's often a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But it is preferable normally to be either being single or particularly being divorced. If you look at all the statistics on marriage, for example, you will see people generally have, when they're happily married, longer life expectancy, greater life satisfaction than the alternative. Regional integration is a little bit like that. It is to be the preferred option, but it's not always easy. Now, this brings me to the reason why I'm giving you this talk. You may have noticed at this stage in my presentation that I'm not originally from Eastern Africa. And in actual fact, I'm from the country which is probably least well qualified to be talking to people about the benefits from regional integration. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. And for me, Brexit was a big tragedy. It was a terrible divorce. It was a big shock to me because as a young economist and young person, I'd really taken advantage, or I'd been fortunate enough to have advantages from being a European Union member. I went to study in Spain. The Spanish government was very generous. They paid for my PhD studies, and I spent 14 years of my life living and working in Spain. That would not have been possible without the European Union. And for this reason, I've become somewhat evangelical about the reasons why Africa should not miss the same opportunity to come together, to create those same opportunities for its people, and particularly for young people, I think. The ability to work or study in other member states, for example. And that brings me to some final reflections here. In our book, we stress this is not just about trade. Most people will talk about the AFCFTA in terms of encouraging people to engage in export. But the reality is the majority of people do not engage in trade themselves directly. I think we have to change the discourse a little bit and focus a little bit more on the benefits for you as African citizens. And there's already some very good tangible examples of this across the continent. So, for example, here within the East African community, back in 2014, they removed roaming charges when you move from one member state to another, a very good precedent. In SADC, in Southern Africa, If you are a student from, for example, Tanzania, you can go and study in South Africa and you will pay the same fees as you would as if you were a South African national. So those are the kind of tangible benefits that I think we need to be focusing on, because it's not just a question of small businesses benefiting from this, it's actually for the general population. And this is why in the book we have a chapter which Francis wrote, which is about especially dedicated to the free movement protocol, which is an essential part of the agreement. The free movement protocol will allow people to work, study, and live in other member states. Without that, it's difficult to do cross-border business. So we very much endorse the implementation of the free movement protocol as well as the AFCFTA. So final words, I think it's always good to give the final words to the ladies. Here's a quote from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who you will all be familiar with her work. In an interview, I think she put the matters very, very clearly. She said, part of the problem is that the rest of the world sees Africa as something to use. And sadly, Africans, we agree. We don't talk enough to one another, and we're always looking outwards. And when she was asked specifically about the situation regarding regional integration and continental integration under the AFCFTA, she said, I don't think it will be a utopia, but a more united Africa, an Africa that trades more with one another. I think she summed up beautifully what the objectives are of the AFCFTA. And I think we're coming to a moment when we need some urgency in terms of the implementation of this agreement. And that begins with all of us in terms of pressuring, advocating, whether it's in our private communities or whether it's business groups. We all need to be aware of the benefits and not to miss this unique opportunity to really strengthen the economic future of the continent for everybody. Thank you very much.